Edward III is widely regarded as one of the greatest medieval kings of England. The prominent historian and author Ian Mortimer even went as far as to call Edward the perfect king. But was Edward, in fact, not all that he is cracked up to be? Edward is best remembered now for being the king who started, in inverted commas, the Hundred Years' War. The origins of the Hundred Years' War, of course, started long before Edward's time, arguably all the way back to the Norman conquest of England. Edward spent large amounts of time, money, and resources pursuing his claims in France. Edward, through his mother, who was a daughter of Philip IV, claimed the French crown was rightfully his. But being a great king was more than just declaring war on a foreign enemy. True, Edward was unquestionably a fine military leader, winning famous victories, such as the triumph at Crecy in 1346. Edward even distinguished himself at sea, winning naval battles at Sluys and Winchelsea. But despite these notable and undoubtedly fine achievements, the prospect of Edward ever becoming King of France was never realistic, even after the capture of King John II by Edward's son, the Black Prince, after his victory at Poitiers in 1356. Edward would eventually retract his claims to the French crown, and it could be argued that his ventures were largely futile. The only time during the conflict England ever came close to a total victory over the French was during the reign of Henry V. As the wars with France rumbled on, a disaster befell Edward, England, and Europe as a whole in the late 1340s as the Black Death wreaked havoc across the continent. Nobody was safe from the outbreak, though the poor, gathered together in close proximity in villages, towns, and cities, were far more vulnerable to the plague than those from the upper classes who could afford to escape to their manors and estates out in the country. As ordinary workers were cut down by the plague in their thousands, demand for ordinary labourers to carry out everyday essential jobs went through the roof. As a result, wages skyrocketed, causing the king some considerable consternation. The nobility, with their vast and numerous estates, needed the services of ordinary labourers for general maintenance and found themselves paying more and more for the services. Edward, needing his nobles to be in good financial order so they could properly prepare themselves for campaigning in France, introduced the Statute of Labourers in 1351 in an effort to restrict the rise of wages among the working class. Unsurprisingly, measures such as these led to a gradual increase of resentment among the general population as an opportunity to increase general living standards for ordinary English people was, quite clearly, being oppressed. Although there would be other factors at play as well, it can be said that Edward's actions around the time of the outbreak of the Black Death was a direct and contributing factor to the outbreak of the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, 4 years after Edward's death. Edward's reign was a long one, too long ultimately, just shy of 50 years. As he grew older, Edward became increasingly feeble, particularly after the death of his queen, Philippa, in 1369. Edward had been especially close with Philippa, and her death was a bitter blow for the king. As a result, Edward became dependent on the company of a particular mistress, Alice Perez, for comfort in his old age. Alice used and manipulated Edward, helping herself to almost anything she wanted, and became exceedingly wealthy as a result, not to mention hated. Whilst Edward III's declining physical and mental condition does provide him some mitigating factors For the obvious decline in his reign in the 1360s and 70s, it is still no excuse. Edward's grandfather, Edward I, was still campaigning against Scotland when he succumbed to his final illness in 1307 at the age of 68. Edward III, when he died a lonely, miserable death 70 years later in 1377, was 64 and stood in complete contrast to Edward I. Whilst Edward I was still defending England from its enemies even up until virtually his final breath, Edward III would leave England vulnerable to foreign invasions. Had an invasion come during Edward III's final days, then the king would have been able to do very little about it. Edward I had also left the succession in better order than Edward III. Edward I was succeeded by a strapping young man, Edward II, although unfortunately Edward II would prove to be utterly hopeless as king. Edward III was leaving a young boy, his grandson, the 10-year-old Richard II, to succeed him. The condition a king left his country in upon his death is an indicator of how strong his reign had actually been. In 1377, England was not in a healthy state, and tensions across the land were about to explode. Edward III remains one of England's most popular medieval kings, but whether that popularity is justified is certainly up for debate. To answer the title question, was Edward III really a great king? For me, the answer is no. Declaring war on a foreign superpower and winning a few battles that ultimately didn't lead to anything is not enough to justify that status. For the definition of great medieval kingship, one need only look at the reign of King Edward I rather than the reign of Edward III.